Well, I remember 25 years or more ago when I was a graduate student here and at the Kennedy School, and we were a group of us, Mary Jo Bain, David Elwood, Julie Wilson, and others, were studying, trying to get a handle on issues around ghettos and ghetto poverty, underclass, all these different words that we were debating at that time. And I know that I can tell you that we were hanging on every word that was coming out of Chicago, both by Bill and his colleagues. And we pored over those drafts of the chapters before the book was even published and went through it. And it was really a model of social science. It was a big part of my education was just seeing how he operated. First of all, the laying out the theoretical foundations and the theoretical arguments in a way that allowed them to be tested. And then also, of course, bringing to bear the evidence quantitatively and ethnographically. All of it was just, and not to mention, of course, in the end, asking what it all meant for policy. So this to me was a big part of my education, even though I didn't have you as a professor here. It felt like I did. And of course, I'm so glad I've had the opportunity to get to know you in the years afterwards. But even more important than social science, I think, was there was a sense of moral urgency in the papers that were coming from Bill and in the book that really inspired us and really motivated us to want to do more work in this area. And so I want to thank you for the social science and also for the sense of moral urgency that you contain in your writings. So I'm going to not exactly follow the theme of this panel, and I have the permission of Bruce Western to do that. We discussed it. I'm going to talk a bit about the changes in concentrated poverty since the publication of The Truly Disadvantaged. And just very briefly, the facts were that we had a doubling of concentration of poverty in terms of the number of census tracts that were above 40%, or the population that lived there, or the percent of the population that lived there. Essentially it doubled between 1970 and 1990. And this is really driven by the structural forces. The differences between metropolitan areas were explained mostly by the relative changes in economic conditions in those metropolitan areas. But there was also a very important contribution overall by the selective outmigration of the non-poor and both African Americans and whites withdrawing from the city to the suburbs because of exclusionary zoning and racial discrimination in housing markets in the suburbs and so forth. This contributed to the overall increase in concentrated poverty. Then we saw this enormous decline in concentrated poverty by the year 2000, driven by the very strong economy, 4% unemployment, rising wages across the board for perhaps one of the few times since in recent decades. And also housing policy changed such that housing policy was contributing to decentralizing concentrations of poverty rather than increasing it. So one question is, what has happened since then, and how has concentrated poverty changed? And it's a little complicated to study this now because we've changed the data collection method entirely. Instead of having the point-in-time long form of the census, we now have what's called the American Community Survey. Probably most of you are familiar with it, but the data that we're getting is actually a collection of 60 monthly samples. So there's a possible downward bias in how concentrated poverty in particular would be measured by the ACS. Because imagine you had a metropolitan area that had 5 high poverty census tracts at the beginning of the 60 months. And due to gentrification, abandonment, just general shifts in the demographics, you had 5 census tracts that were high poverty at the end of the 60 months, but they were different ones. So during the period of time, they sort of migrated. So it's possible that when you actually aggregate the 60 monthly samples, that none of those census tracts will appear to have been above 40% at any time. So that's a downward bias, and I don't want to get into too much more than that other than to say when you look at the numbers, think it's probably worse than what he's saying. And also, because it's an aggregate over 60 months, the data that I'm going to show you covers the period 2005 to 2009, and 2 of those years are before the crash, so it's probably an underestimate. So what happened? Well, from 1990 to 2000, there was a very large decline in the number of census tracts that were high poverty, from 3,400 to 2,500, but by 2007, it had gone back up, almost to the same level as 1990. So that's suggesting that the year 2000 was really an aberration, and we need to understand that concentrated poverty is still with us. There was also a fairly large increase in the number of middle poverty census tracts. So that's another, somewhat a small decline in the 40 or more, but some increase in the middle. The trend really depends on whether you use 20% or 40%. So 20%, you see it's a steady rise, but with 40%, it goes down to 2000 and then back up. So there's this long-term trend towards more middle poverty neighborhoods. And so part of the question that also the number, of course, is affected. So we have 9 million people living in high poverty, 40% neighborhoods, and about the same number in 2007, which is actually covering that period. But many more who live in, if we look at 20%. So which is the right level as far as studying the kinds of social dislocations that Bill Wilson talked about? I think there's a strong argument really to use the 40% level. And the reason is that Bill Wilson talked about norms and what children saw as the normal thing. This shows from the 2000 census family structure. And if you look, of course, in low poverty neighborhoods, the dominant family structure is married couple. But by the time you get up to the 40% level, less than half of the families with children are married couple children. So the norm really is not living in a married couple family in neighborhoods where there's 40% poverty or more. So also if we look at labor force participation, in low poverty neighborhoods, there's 75% of men are in the labor force, and it's less than half once you get above 40%. So a child growing up in those neighborhoods actually sees a different world than a mainstream child in a low poverty neighborhood. Just a couple of quick ways in which there's been a change in the nature of concentrated poverty. And I think what you see here is that the non-Hispanic white has grown to a much larger proportion of the population. The growth of 77% among whites. And also, that's quite a different finding, I think. If we look at neighborhoods dominated by a single race or ethnic group, it used to be that there were only about a third of these high poverty census tracts had no dominant racial or ethnic group. They were a mixture, Hispanic, Black, or other groups. Now it's getting close to 1/2. So equal opportunity, high poverty zones, I guess. I don't think that's progress per se, but it's different, and I think something that we have to get to understand more about. Looking also at the concentration of poverty, so this is the percentage of the poor that live in high poverty neighborhoods. Overall, it's not as high as it was in 1990, although again, I think that's an underestimate in terms of today. But the interesting thing is that the level among whites has gone back to the level it was in 1990. And the level among whites in in metropolitan areas, in micropolitan areas, which are these smaller areas, smaller than metropolitan areas like Lebanon, New Hampshire, and Eureka, California, places like that, is pretty high. I think it's surprisingly high. And then also other areas, not areas that are neither in metropolitan nor micropolitan areas, have a pretty high level of white concentration of poverty. So there's some interesting questions there about how is that different and how does it connect to things that we know historically about the ghettos and barrios. And so then there's an issue of metropolitan area size. I think a lot of, since suburbanization was driving concentration of poverty in some ways, a lot of the larger metropolitan areas have reached their limit, and they're suburbanization-wise, too far out, they're built out, the ability to get to the center city is too difficult with the traffic. So you notice that in the large metropolitan areas of 1 million or more, there were, the number of increases and decreases were not that different, okay. But in the smaller metropolitan areas, we see a pronounced movement towards increased concentration of poverty. So this disease of, of sorting people out and having high poverty zones has now moved further and further down the line to smaller metropolitan areas. And part of that is that the suburbanization trends that really started in the larger metropolitan areas are now being taken by developers and moved out to those areas. One more thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to call this, to quote Ira Katznelson from last night, the deconcentration of concentration. And so here is a map of concentration of poverty in 1990 in a city that some of you may be familiar with. And then if we go to the 2005 to 2009 data, you'll notice how the high poverty areas are not so concentrated. They're about the same number, but they've spread out. I'll just do that again, a little animation. And so that's pretty striking. Let's look at Detroit. Here's Detroit, and there's the high poverty zone in 1990. Here we go in 2005 to 2009. So the concentration, the high poverty census tracts are not themselves as concentrated as they used to be. So they're probably less visible because they're sort of scattered around more. And so that's another difference. And does that make a difference in terms of the experience of people living there? It's not something that I don't think we've ever studied. I haven't seen anything like that. Dallas is another one, same pattern. I see this almost everywhere that I look. Here's New York, and again, definitely more of the purple zones are the highest poverty census tracts. I should have said that at the beginning. But as you can see, they're more scattered. I decided that looking at maps is sort of impressionistic, and so I wanted to do it more systematically. So I calculated what's called a Moran's eye. It's a measure of spatial autocorrelation. So I looked at the poverty rates, and within each metropolitan area, we look at how clustered the high poverty census tracts are, or how clustered poverty rates are in each metropolitan area. And what I see is very consistently, the ones here that are in red are places that have a statistically significant decline in this measure of the clustering of poverty rates. So it's a pretty broad trend. So my brief conclusion, since my time is low, are that concentration of poverty is still with us, very much so. It's changing its character a little bit in that we have more racial diversity within high poverty zones. And it's becoming more spread out as central cities gentrify. There's some deconcentration of concentration, and all of those things contribute to the situation that we have now. But it's still an important problem, and so the sense of moral urgency that Bill provided for us, we should still be feeling that, and we should still be continuing to work in this area. So, thank you.